On here, just to give you a big overview before we break it down and start looking through the lines individually, I want you to look at the blue line here, and this blue line is the left ventricle. And so it's really just telling you the pressure changes throughout a cycle of the left ventricle. Pressure is really, really low right here. Then the ventricle, its job is supposed to be low, it's filling, and then the ventricle squeezes. And then it relaxes and fills again, and then it squeezes. And it relaxes and fills again, and it squeezes. So it just does the same thing over and over again. And that's how this is. Relaxed, squeezing, relaxed, at rest, squeezing, relaxed. So it goes on. So you sort of see that as we see the pressure changes. Develops pressure, relaxes again. Develops pressure, relaxes again. Likewise, you can see in the red line, when the ventricle is developing pressure, the whole point of the heart is to squeeze and eject blood out so it can deliver to the body. So the red line is the volume. So when it's ejecting, the volume of the left ventricle goes down. It's like a gas gauge. It's getting more and more empty because it's sending it on its way to the body. So just to look at it as a big picture, when the pressure is up, it's pushing the blood out. So people get kind of, they see up lines, down lines, it starts to swirl around. And so I want you to sort of look at it on the big picture so you're not intimidated by it. And of course it's intimidating because there's lots of lines all over it. Then we also know this other blue line, which is the electrocardiogram. The cycle of the heart where it's, you know, resting and relaxed, developing pressure, contracting, relaxing again, resting and relax. We can actually fit in the whole point of the electrocardiogram where we have the P wave, QRS, the T wave, and we can kind of place that. So the timing of these, what I want to go through is not only that you understand the cardiac cycle, when blood's going from the atria, when it's going to the ventricles, when it's being ejected, when valves are closed, when they're opening, but also exactly the timing of these occurring. So that's what's going to be the other critical element that we're going to put together. And then we're going to throw in a bunch of new terms that we're going to deal with as well. So that's quite a bit that I want to cover today. My goal is to get through it, and then you'll have the weekend to really process it, because a week from today is your first exam. So we have Monday. Is my intention to not have new material, but the reality, probably, thank you, is if we don't get through everything today, we'll have a little bit on Monday. That shouldn't be too big of a deal, but I don't want to overcram you today. I want to give you a lot of the basic elements so that you can really spend time working on this, so that Monday is really just clarifying a few issues rather than starting off from scratch. So that's my goal of today, is to really power through this. And so here we go. So what we'll kind of work through what's happening in the heart bit by bit. I'll draw here a picture. So this is from the perspective of the left ventricle. So from the perspective, so we'll just draw the left ventricle. So we have this here being the left ventricle. What part of the heart brings blood into the left ventricle? Left atrium. So we'll draw left atrium here. So left atrium. Blood going into the left atrium comes from where? The lungs. Yeah. From the lungs, let's say from via pulmonary veins. Okay, so it comes into the left atrium. And what is this valve that is here between the left? The mitral valve, what's another name? Bicuspid. And just the generic name that we'll be referring to it here is going to be the atrioventricular valve. And then we have the left ventricle, and then coming out of the left ventricle is going to be the aorta. And we have, that has a valve as well. So then that is the aortic semilunar valve. There we go. Okay, so those are all the players that we got going here. So we're going to put them into perspective. Oh, I forgot to grab a red pen. I'll use pink. So I'm just going to walk through, just so we're on the same page. I'll just sort of say it before we draw it. The cardiac cycle is we have blood coming from the lungs. It's coming into the left atrium. It's dropping down this open atrioventricular valve, Blood's coming in, filling up. When we finally decide to start the cycle, then we have the P wave. Remember, the P wave tells the atria, gives it the signal. After the P wave, the atria, and I'm only having just the left side, but both sides are doing this at the same time, will contract, pushes extra blood in here. So we have a little extra surge of blood and pressure. And then the ventricles through the QRS get stimulated, get the signal to stimulate. The ventricles get to contract and start to develop force. As soon as it just initiates its contraction and gets rigid, that atrioventricular valve is going to close. The left ventricle's walls are going to start squeezing, pushing in until it develops enough pressure to open up this aortic semilunar valve to let blood out. It's going to continue to contract while it's pushing blood out to the body, out via the aorta. Then the ventricle relaxes. We see that during the T wave. When it relaxes, the pressure drops. This valve will close again. Pressure will drop sufficiently to where the blood that's been waiting its turn kind of in the left atrium while the ejections are taking place finally gets through the open atrioventricular valve, and we fill again for the next cycle. So are we all good with that? Just kind of the process. So having gone through that, now let's draw it out in that form and translate it to graphical form. So if we have, we'll start with the pressure. So the pressure, who can tell me the units of pressure? What? That's part of it. What was the other part? Millimeters of mercury, yeah. So the units are millimeters of mercury. Have a little historical perspective for you, but we'll let you suffer the full detail of it when we do unit 2, when we actually talk more about blood pressure in a lot more detail. But suffice it to say, when blood pressure was first discovered, it was, you identified, cutting a vein, blood just oozes out at low pressure. When an artery is cut, it spurts. That was the first observation to indicate that the heart beating has something to do with the delivery of blood. And so trying to quantify how hard is it spurting blood. So it had come to a cannula, which is like a test tube without a bottom. So like a little glass tube shoved into the neck of a horse, and it was filled with water. And so what they did was they fill it with water and they stick it in the carotid artery, and every time the carotid artery would beat, that pressure would push the water upward. And so they took a little measuring device and they were able to say, oh, it was here, and it goes to here, and it goes down to here with each beat, and they could see how much it moved. But water would displace quite a large amount. So they decided, well, what can we do that's not this giant tube sticking here? So they were able to shrink the tube down when they used something liquid, but also something very, very heavy, and that would be mercury. So mercury had enough weight so that when the blood pushed up against it, it would just move it a little bit. And therefore we have millimeters, that's the distance here, of mercury. So that's how it became the standard unit for pressure. So anyways, that's your little historical perspective. I got pictures and everything for vessels for that one, but that's what. So I'm a big unit fan. If you stick with units, your life will be easier, especially when you take chemistry. So that's my chemistry tip to you also. Pressure is going to be millimeters of mercury. So we'll talk about that. We're going to do a graph up here. That's going to be our electrocardiogram. And eventually we're going to do the volume here at the bottom, just like we have up there. So let's walk through the description I just had of the cardiac cycle. I'll draw it, toggle back and forth. So when the heart is just at rest, it's filling. Now the resting phase of the heart, let's see, is known as diastole. And I'd like you to think of diastole in the heart as the equivalent of filling. Filling with blood, specifically. Now this is an overgeneralization, because there's phases, parts of diastole when it's not filling. Systole is when the ventricles are contracting, and therefore ejecting blood. There are parts of the phases where the blood's not actually leaving, but it's the contraction phase, so it's really the working phase. This can be quite confusing because most of you guys are more familiar with the terms diastole and systole with regard to blood pressure. Blood pressure diastole and systole is different than ventricular diastole and systole. So there can be a little confusion there. There's some things that are similar, but there's some things that can also be a little bit different that gets people switched around. So for the ventricular perspective, if you just think of diastole as the ventricles, the muscles relaxed and it's filling with blood, systole is when it's contracting and working. You know, most of that time is going to be sending blood out. For the blood pressure, it's the two numbers. Everyone's familiar with like someone's blood pressure, 120/80. So the systolic blood pressure is going to be 120. 80 is going to be the diastolic blood pressure. So the reason where this confusion comes in with systole and diastole is that the diastolic blood pressure is going to come into play in our graph during ventricular systole. So you just don't have, we're in diastole, everything. No, you might be in ventricular diastole because that means the ventricle, the muscles relaxed and you're filling. But blood pressure diastole, the number is important at a time that's during systole in the ventricle. So you can see where there's a little confusion. So I like to, when I talk about the blood pressure, I will call it the blood pressure, you know, the systolic blood pressure or diastolic blood pressure to be very clear that that's what we're referring to and it's those two numbers. And then otherwise with the heart, we'll talk about systole and diastole, but I generally will talk about it relaxed or filling with blood, contracting. So again, there is a little crossover. I just wanted to bring it to your attention because I get students that get these mixed up a lot because they're more familiar with the blood pressure term. Okay, so during the resting relaxation phase, the heart's not doing anything, just kind of just sitting there. It's not being asked to contract or do anything. It's just there, low pressure. Draw this on the graph. So we got a 0 here, nice low pressure. Blood pressure is nice and low. When the heart's pressure is the electrocardiogram, well, we're not doing anything on the electrocardiogram either. Just nothing's going on electrocardiogram wise. But in the heart, physically, what's the blood doing? So when the heart is at rest in diastole, where's the blood going? Yes, so the blood is doing this. There you go. So that's my giant arrow going from the left atrium into the left ventricle. It's coming from the lungs and it's flowing right through the valve. That atrioventricular valve here is wide open, and it's just like you're filling a water balloon. You see the water low, or not water, the blood level just rising, rising, rising. It's just filling up more and more. So that's where we see, see, I draw these things at a slant. So this, I'm intending for this to be flat. I'm not very good at that. Okay, and then we have, we'll do the volume. The unit of volume is going to be milliliters. Okay, so during this phase, blood is spilling. So it's getting more and more and more and more and more. So you can see this is going up like a gas gauge. It's getting more and more full. When the heart begins, says, okay, let's have a beat. What's the start of the beat? What initiates a heartbeat? SA node, the sinoatrial node. So when the sinoatrial node that's sitting there in the right atrium sends a signal out, and that signal crosses over across the right atrium and across this left atrium, what do we record for that event? The P wave. So the P wave, I'm going to put this here. The P wave says, hey, there's an electrical signal coming through the atrium after the P wave. So not the same time, but after, because the P wave is the electrical signal. But after the electrical signal comes the actual mechanical event, which is what? What is the heart then doing after the P wave? Yep. So the atria gets its signal, so we do this in orange, and then once it gets its signal to contract, then it's going to do, the walls are going to contract in, so the atrial walls squeeze in, pushing down extra blood, whatever extra blood happened to be. It's not a lot of blood, because most of the blood was just blowing right through, filling up the left ventricle anyways. But when the heart says, hey, we're ready to have a beat, atria, here you go. Why don't you top off the ventricle? Why don't we just push whatever's in there that's left over? I think the analogy I gave is like people are loading up on a subway, then all of a sudden they're like, subway's gonna go, and somebody on the deck is like shoves the last few people just in. It's like this extra little surge before the doors close. So that's what we have here. So you have the P wave happening. Do this to line up. And immediately after the P wave, you're going to have this pressure surge. That's the people getting shoved into the subway. So that is the atria here squeezing and pushing just an extra little bit of blood down into the ventricle. So on the volume, we see this as an extra little bump of blood that got put in there. But it also got more actual volume at the same time. So that's why you see both of these would be parallel, just a teeny bit after the P wave. Are we all good at that?
So once the P wave hits, does the pressure and they both go up at the same time? Would it be simultaneous, or would the P wave hit and then the pressure would be
after? Yeah, P wave and then after. It's just jogged after, because you have the signal and then the muscle contracts.
Okay. So the signal of P wave would be the whole G fibers?
No, just the atria.
Just
So we haven't got to the Purkinje fibers yet. So we're stretching that process out that we talked about before. So we're just only sinoatrial node across the atria. So then, while the atria, both of them are doing it. We're just talking about the left atrium at this point, squeezing, sending extra blood down to the ventricle. Electrically, not much is happening. Nothing's happening. You don't see this as an electrical event. You just see got the signal. Now it's doing it, so electrically nothing's happening, but physically we're getting more pressure and a little bit more blood down from the perspective of the ventricle. So then the next electrical event is, it's that AV node, that's what's also going on during this time, and then it sends it down the bundle of hits, down the bundle branches, and then around the Purkinje fibers. So what we're getting is ventricular depolarization, the signal to the ventricles that it's now going to be its turn to contract. But this is just the signal that's going. So we will have kind of a tighter block there. And the QRS happens, I'm just going to draw an orange circle here and an orange circle here that coordinates with that. Textbooks draw the QRS during this time a lot more stretched out than it really should be. I might over tighten up, but the signal happens on this picture before. You can't have the QRS saying we're getting the signal while clearly at this point the ventricle is squeezing. You know, the signal actually happens before the squeezing. So there's often a bit of a lag difference. So as long as it's just right around this corner that we're about to draw, because then the pressure is going to go up. So we have the QRS, which is the electrical signal coming down into the ventricle. As soon as it gets this electrical signal to contract, very quickly the walls become very rigid. And, and then obviously from being rigid to squeezing in. But just the moment that the walls become rigid, the walls stiffen, the blood that is within the ventricle kind of bulges up a little. And when it bulges up, it actually catches the cusps of the atrioventricular valve. So you're with me on that? So we've got, and in fact, I'll draw this orange so that it will match the orange dot on the graph. So at this point, we have the atrioventricular valve is closed because we've got this made the ventricular walls rigid, which caused the blood to lift up just slightly enough to close that atrioventricular valve. Just draw a little arrow here. and call it AV valve closes. So at this point, when the atrioventricular valve is closed, is any more blood coming in? Nope. So we are done filling, really. So this is the end of diastole, the end of the resting phase, because obviously now it's getting rigid. So we've finished diastole. We're just starting the systole or the contraction phase. So the end of diastole is the end of filling. So essentially, this point here is the fullest that the ventricle will be. And that term is end diastolic volume, which is the fullest. So people get this backwards all the time. So I want you to really think of diastole as even though they're relaxed, but it's the filling. So this is the fullest it's going to be. But now the ventricle has to develop pressure. What must happen next? So the walls are now getting very rigid, really thick, and the walls are now starting to squeeze in, and pressure is starting to build. So pressure is going up and up and up, trying to reach the blood, squeezing it. But what is it trying to? What's its purpose? Right. It wants to push it out the aorta. So it's squeezing so hard in here, we're increasing pressure to what point? There's a point that we have to increase to open this aortic valve. Who can speculate as to what kind of pressure do we have to reach to open the aortic valve? 80. So if we have somebody's normal blood pressure, so now we're doing systole diastole, but in blood pressure language. So if we have someone with, we're familiar, 120 over 80. So their systolic blood pressure is 120 millimeters of mercury, and 80 is their diastolic blood pressure. Okay, so the diastolic blood pressure is the lowest it's going to be. So really, in this person, that's what's right here right now, 80 millimeters of mercury. That's the lowest the pressure is going to be. That's why it's called diastolic, because it's the lowest it would be. However, the ventricle, the walls are squeezing, it's trying to develop enough pressure, so it's going up and up and up until it reaches the point of 80. I'm going to do this little circle, maroon circle here. And I'm going to draw this maroon circle right here. Down from it. And electrically, nothing's going on. Between these two circles, the orange circle and the maroon circle, what is the volume doing? Are we getting more volume in, or are we getting volume out, or is the volume staying the same? Staying the same. So I'm going to draw this as a flat line. On the volume side of things, it's the same. We are up on the pressure, so we're developing pressure, but the blood is going nowhere. So this is known, the term for this is known as the prefix that means same is iso. So you have ISO, and it's isovolumic, meaning same volume. So it's isovolumic contraction. So it's the isovolumic contraction phase. That is this point here as well as this point here. So once we reach that dot, so we reach up to pressure of 80 and basically 81, this valve opens, and now blood can now escape the left ventricle and go out the aorta. But does the ventricle want to stop then? No. So it's like if your car ran out of gas in the middle of an intersection, you know, that would really be bad. You know, you would have to like go, oh no, you would put your car in neutral, hopefully have somebody to drive it for you, but you have to get in the back and you'd like start pushing your car. And you know, you have to develop a lot of force just to get the car rolling. That's like the ventricle squeezing just to get the aortic valve to open. But once you get your car rolling, you don't be like, okay, I'm done now, it's rolling. No, you gotta now give it the heave-ho, right? So that you can add some momentum. So the blood that's in here, once we open this valve, we gotta give it the heave-ho, because you have one little batch of blood, and that little batch of blood is like pushing a kid on a sled. You've got one push, and so it's got to leave the heart, it's got to have enough energy to go all the way to your toes and make it all the way back to the heart again. So here's our heave-ho. So even though we had, you know, we got developed pressure, we continue to develop pressure. So till we reach the peak. And in this case, the peak is, so we can color coordinate everything, will be 120. So 120 is actually the blood pressure term for the peak of the ventricular contraction. So that is why, although you're not aware of it, most people get their blood pressure measured and they have, you know, 120 over 80. Well, all of a sudden, what if, you know, you're 150 over 110? Okay, that's not good. Well, no, oh, that'd be bad. Why is it bad? Well, it means your ventricle has to develop 110 millimeters of mercury before blood even starts to leave. That's a lot of work for every single beat. And then, of course, it's going to be higher the systolic because it still has to give the heave-ho. So high blood pressure, especially diastolic, is more important because you're talking about how much work the heart does before it even is able to move blood anywhere. So the blood pressure measurements that you would get on someone's arm, obviously extrapolated back, so only the brachial artery extrapolated back to the aorta, is giving you an indicator of what the heart's facing. What did the heart peak out at? That would be the systolic blood pressure. What did the heart just to open the aortic semilunar valve? That's a diastolic blood pressure. So why don't I write that here? So diastolic blood pressure equals pressure of the left ventricle to open the aortic semilunar valve. And I will write the systolic blood pressure equals the maximum pressure generated by the left ventricle. So this is so important that you're going to see this exact same thing and probably the exact same test questions that would be on this when we get to Unit 2, because we're going to talk about blood pressure and vessels. So a likely test question would be, you know, here's this person's blood pressure. What pressure would it be? Pressures would be required to open the aortic semilunar valve, or what is the maximal pressure that the ventricle achieved in a given beat? And that would be the maximal. That's the valve opening. So we'll just, because I want you to have some physical attribute to what blood pressure is, rather than just it's a number, high, low. What does it actually mean? What is it really telling you is going on inside the body? Okay. So we'll go back to this. Everybody have this? Because I'm going to erase it. Yes.
When it comes to blood pressure, so diastolic, see if it's lower than.
It's always going to be lower. So the diastolic.
But when you go to low blood pressure.
So if someone has low blood pressure, so if you're looking at like 80 over 40.
Yeah. It's still the diastolic is more important.
Well, in that case, the systolic is probably more important because you're likely to not have enough driving pressure. That's where people with low blood pressure pass out, because they don't have enough driving pressure to overcome gravity. And so then they're more lightheaded in those situations. So in that case, it would be more, but that's less common. So yes, in that case, it would be a little bit more of what's driving that person's symptoms. Okay. So back to business. So our little drawing here. Where are we? Kind of recap. The ventricle was at rest between beats. Finally, the P wave starts things off. P wave gives the signal. After that, the atria contract, sends some blood down into the ventricle. So we top off the ventricle. Right after that, the QRS stiffens up the left ventricle, and then the left ventricle will proceed to contract. But the initial stiffening slams shut the atrioventricular valve. Pressure develops. We have a flat line on the volume because no more blood's coming in, but no blood is leaving yet. We finally developed enough pressure that we exceeded the pressure across that aortic semilunar valve. So now, at this point, we open the aortic semilunar valve, but the ventricle continued to squeeze. While it continued to squeeze, the blood is now leaving. So I'm going to draw this in blue so I can match, color code this blue part to this part. So you can see as this is dropping down, the volume, so again, if you think of this like a gas gauge, the volume in the ventricle is getting lower because it's leaving the ventricle. But the pressure is going up because it's squeezing and pushing it out. So people get kind of mixed up because they're going up and down. Picture in your head, squeezing, so that's going to be the high pressure, but shooting it out. And that's this, because it's just lowering, it's like a gas gauge again, it's lowering the volume so you have less left over. Okay? So this is, and I'll write this here. Ejection of blood out of the left ventricle. So that would be this little slide down. And you can see on here, that's what this is corresponding with, sliding down. Okay? So then the ventricle, it squeezes, it's contracted, and finally it goes to relax. So the ventricular relaxation, the physical relaxation, where it's no longer squeezing the wall, it's working its way back down, is the only time that that physical event is happening at the same time the electrical event. So if we have our peak here, we'll have our T wave there. So let me make our line continue over here. So we have our T wave, and while the ventricle is now relaxing and pressure's going down. So pressure is now going down. The ventricular wall is no longer rigid. It's actually enlarging. It's stopped going down. Pressure is dropping. I have decreasing pressure written here. And the blood that was shooting out, all of a sudden think of it as this column of blood going out, and then now it's like, ooh, wanting to fall back in because the pressure now is dropping. So the blood that was shooting out, pressure's dropping here, so now it's starting to fall back, and as it falls back, it is going to catch that aortic valve and close it. So if we have a ventricle here, they are squeezing, and here's your aorta, shooting blood out. And so that aortic valve is off to the side, opened up because blood's shooting out. As soon as this ventricle is now relaxing, pressure's dropping, so the column of blood that was shooting out is now starting to fall back, and when it falls back, it catches the cusps of that semilunar valve, closes it, blood comes down, and it literally bounces against the valve, and it does this little springboard thing that's known as the Dichroic Notch. So now I get to get caught up with this part. So where that happens, let's close there. Do this about here. It happens just a teeny bit higher than this. Show you with the aortic pressure here of the aorta. It comes down between beats. This is coming out, you're measuring the aorta. As soon as that aortic valve opens and the ventricle is pushing blood out, the pressure of the aorta is matching it. And then as soon as the ventricle starts to relax, so does the pressure in the aorta. That's where the column of blood is starting to come down, and then it catches those valves. The valve, semilunar valve catches, the pressure wave hits, the valve closes, that's what that dot is, and it literally bounces back up, and then it comes back down again, and it's going forward again. So that little jog that we have here is known as the Dichroic Notch. That dot there specifically is the closure of the aortic semilunar valve, where this one was the opening. So we start off, just to kind of go from the peak, we were at the point where the pressure, we're shooting blood out. As soon as the pressure in the ventricle started to drop, we had a slight reversal. Blood pressure drops back down here, shuts this aortic semilunar valve. You have the blood sort of bounce and ricochet off of it like that. That's our dichroic notch. Meanwhile, the pressure in the ventricle is going to continue to drop down. Maybe not that far here on my graph. It's going to continue to go down. So let's check out with the volume. Once we closed our aortic valve right here, we have no more blood leaving, so it's not going to go down any further. But we haven't opened the atrioventricular valve yet, so we don't have any more blood coming in. Between the point of there and about here, when our atrioventricular valve is going to open again, between here and here, we have no movement, right? No more new blood's coming in, no more other blood is leaving, right? Because both valves are closed. So what would we call this? Isovolumic, exactly. But instead of contraction of going up, it is relaxation. So this portion here, this is Isoleumic Relaxation. So that's happening where both valves are closed. So Isovolumic Relaxation is also going to be, you can see this here as a flat portion of the volume diagram. Don't worry, we're going to go through this again. So we're sort of walking it through so that we're all kind of jiving with the step-by-steps of what the heart's doing and all these waves here and naming things, make sure we get all our terms in, and then we'll whip them out again. So as we get the pressure here starts to drop sufficiently, meanwhile, this whole time that the ventricle was squeezed and sending blood out the aorta, what's the atrium doing? Yeah, so the blood from the lungs, they never stop. So it's just filling. So at the ventricle, the atrium's like, hey, valve's closed. I'm still filling with blood. So there's a lot of blood waiting to enter. So when the ventricle gets low enough pressure, usually lower, about 10 millimeters of mercury, it has to wait to get pretty low for this valve to finally open. And when that valve finally opens, then all the blood that had been waiting in here gushes in there right away, and you end up with this, what they call a rapid filling phase. Because now you're filling back up at the level of the ventricle. Pressure-wise, the ventricle's like nothing's, just low pressure, just getting bigger. You got the kind of the walkthrough, okay? Is there anything weird we need to touch up on before I erase this whole thing and we start again? Okay, yes.
So during isotomic contraction, both valves are closed with the heart still.
Yes. And then isovolumic relaxation, both valves are closed, but the heart's relaxing. So isovolumic, again, meaning same volume. So it's a period of time. You're either building pressure to open the aortic valve, that would be the contraction, or you shut the aortic valve, but you have yet to drop the pressure enough to allow the atrioventricular to open yet, because you're still, the high pressure here is still holding that valve closed. Because it's so pliable here, but this is such, even though this is filling a lot, it's still really low pressure. So it has to get below 10 for it to even open. Okay, are we feeling good about this? You guys feel like you need it, like, you're feeling like it's doable, or is it like, oh my gosh, I should have stayed in bed today, or like, are you like, fine, doable, or who's like, oh my goodness, I'm gonna have to go talk to you later? Okay, but you're welcome to do so. So anyway, come see me if you want to. So my hope is that we'll go through this enough times that you'll start to, get the pieces put together, have enough elements, because your homework isn't really homework, but your homework that I'm recommending that you do is a lot of blank pieces of paper that you're drawing this on. And so you can, draw these out. You're going to take a picture of it. You can send it to me and go, is this right? And then I can tell you if it's right or not right. Or you're like, I'm not sure what happens at this phase. Or you're not sure what's going on and you want to shoot me an email to Zoom with me. We can talk by computer. I can come in on campus, whatever works for you, but I'm accessible. So let me know as we move on. But hopefully we're going through it enough time. We'll give you enough tools that you can piece it together. Yes.
So for pressure, the 120/80 is going to be the blood pressure. So like if it was like 140/70, that would be.
And in fact, I'm glad you brought it up because I really hate using 120/80 because that's just everyone's standard blood pressure. So I like picking random off-the-wall numbers because I want people to realize what the numbers just mean rather than they're just used to regurgitating 120/80. So that's where. So we'll use our subsequent examples will not have. I just had Excel's matching this. Okay. We walked through. So I'm going to erase it so we can start this whole thing over again. So I'm going to do it again the same way we just did it. And then I'm going to teach you the easy way. So I'm going to start off with just one wave at this point. So let's just start with already having a pre-drawn left ventricular wave. And this is, in fact, probably what I'd recommend to you guys to start off with. You're going to have one wave. And now let's fill in the blanks. Let's fill in the blanks with this one wave. We want to draw the electrocardiogram. We want to draw the volume of the left ventricle. We want to draw the pressure, the aortic pressure waves. We want to mark semilunar valve open and close. This is sort of our task list. Atrioventricular valve open and close. We want to know about blood pressure. Let's see. Let's give a blood pressure. We're going to have some patient information. With patient info, say we've got a heart rate of 70 beats a minute. We're going to say, oh, I forgot to tell you a term. Okay, we're going to say his end diastolic volume was 120 milliliters. And I forgot to tell you a couple of things. So I'll add a new term right now, and I'll explain the next one. SV means stroke volume. One beat, how much blood left. Stroke volume, we'll say 80 milliliters. Okay. And then questions. We're going to want to know this person's end systolic volume. We're going to want to know this person's cardiac output. That's a new term too that we're going to get into. So that's kind of where we're going. So this right here for the in-class people, you will likely see this exact scenario. You'll see a single waveform. You'll see a list of like to-do lists, like you're going to be drawing all these things. Here's some information, and I'm going to have you calculate a few things. So that is pretty much going to be the back page of your lab practical. The online people, they have this, and they have to identify various actions throughout this. Only cardiac output. And we haven't done it yet, so it's also up there to remind me to tell you about it. So let's talk about the electrocardiogram. So right here, we already have color coordinated here, PLV. And that's how you subnote it. P was always, capital P always means pressure, and then the subscript is what it is. So we've got PAO later, which will be aortic pressure. So for the electrocardiogram, now that we have this pressure wave, we know this little hump here was the result of the atria squeezing down, right? So before it had to get a signal. So about level with this point is we're going to do the P wave. So if I were to draw, I don't want to draw the P wave here. I'm just going to put it there. It needs to be in its own little area. You good with that, where it's at? I'm going to erase it down here, but it's meant to show you where I lined it up. And then this corner here, where we see the ventricle pressure starting to rise up, we know that this little corner area is going to be the QRS. So I'm going to eyeball this here, and we're just going to do that, QRS. And from the peak, where that peak pressure and going down, this is the only time that the electrical event happens at the same time, not right before, like these two are. So where the peak of this is usually where I put the start of the T wave. You see how it spans that dropping down. And then for the electrocardiogram, then it's just connect the dots. Here, 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 here. All right. Check. We got that done. Okay. Maybe not so bad. So can you see, so I am primarily concerned, not how pretty your electrocardiogram is, but that you have the waves in the appropriate timing. The location and the alignment is more important than the actual shapes. Next, we'll do our volume. Volume of the left ventricle. So if we look at this flat line portion here, we know that the volume is going to be filling. And then this little hump right here, the volume actually mirrors it. So, okay, it's kind of subtle, but you see how it kind of went up a little bit more than it did. So you have this extra little, so you can see it just kind of goes up a little bit. And then we know during the development of pressure, it's going to be flat-lined until there's a point, which will be about here. Just going to sort of draw, estimate visually where it would be. And that's right, to here. So between these two valves, it's developing pressure. This is our isoflumate contraction phase. I'll write that on here. Isovolumic contraction. It's also, I just like to point down here, is the flat. And then from this point, so this is the second green dot, to, and we'll eyeball where the closure would be. So this phase between here and here is going to be the ejection phase. And then pressure is going to drop until finally we open. So the pressure is going to drop, but the volume is going to stay the same because we are now isovolumic relaxation. That's going to be here, the flat line, until we finally get to where our atrioventricular valve opens and we fill it up again. We'll do the aortic pressure. The aortic pressure, we don't start it higher than the peak because it can't ever be higher than the peak. That peak is by definition the peak. So we sort of start a little lower, but it eases down. You have blood moving and the pressure is just slowly dropping over time until the heart beats again to reboost the pressure. So you have the pink line. Once you have the aortic valve open, they match together. The pressures do, the aortic and the left ventricular comes down to the other dot. You have that bounce, the dichroic notch, and then you drops off over time. So now we've got our aortic pressure. So we've already sort of in this conversation identified our semilunars, opening and closing, open, close. The atrioventriculars are backwards. It starts with a close and then it opens. So the fullest that the heart is going to be is our end diastolic volume. What did we say that end diastolic volume is? 120 milliliters. Stroke volume is how much blood left the heart in that beat. How much did the heart eject out? What was ejected? So this would be from this point to this point is known as stroke volume. And we know that, well, based on this person's data, could vary from person to person, is going to be 80 milliliters, which means what's left over in the heart. If we were filled up to 120, we let 80 out. So we have 40 milliliters, so we'll put 40 here. And that level of 40 is known as end systolic volume. And people get this backwards all the time. So that is why, going back to our systole and diastole, or systolic and diastolic conversation. Diastole, or ventricular diastole, is when the ventricular walls are at rest and it's filling. So the end diastole means the end of filling. So that's going to be the fullest that the ventricle will be. So if systole or ventricular systole means contracting and squeezing and sending the blood out to the body, then the end systolic volume is going to be the emptiest that the heart would be. Cardiac output on this board. Cardiac output is how much blood the heart can eject or get rid of in a specified period of time. And that period of time is 1 minute. So it is equals volume of blood ejected in 1 minute. So the key here being volume, so it's a quantity in a time unit. Therefore, the units will be milliliters or liters per minute. Liters per minute. So it's important. Units are important. So cardiac output is more just a general measure, an assessment of your heart's current performance. It's a lot like saying, what is a general assessment of somebody's vehicle's performance? You know, if you're saying you're driving to Phoenix one day and you're like, you know what, my car was getting 25 miles per gallon. It's a distance per a set volume, 1 gallon. How far are you going to go in 1 gallon? Or, you know, maybe you're going to Phoenix and you only got 5 miles to the gallon. Weren't doing so well. You know, like, so it sort of gives you a sense of the performance of that engine. For the heart, its job is to move volume. So with an arbitrary amount of time, in 1 minute, how much can you get done in a minute? That's all it is. It's really just this general assessment. So over time, you're going to have several beats, and each of these beats sends out a certain amount of blood, the stroke volume, and therefore over a minute, how much did it get done? How much did it accomplish? So if you're sitting around like a couch potato, you're going to be around 4 or 5. If you're going to be running and doing a lot of stuff, you're going to be around 10 or 12 or higher if you're really a good athlete. So it varies. So that's all it really is. So how do we calculate it? If we're doing volume in a minute, it is going to be known as your stroke volume. So that's how much you ejected in 1 beat times the heart rate. That tells you how many beats are in 1 minute. So if we use the numbers that we have here, if we have this guy, he is at 80 milliliters, but we'll just say it's 80 milliliters in a single beat, so 1 beat, right, times 70 beats in 1 minute. We cancel beats off, right? So what are we left with? Milliliters per minute. So in this case, do a little math, do 70 times 80. There you go. 5,600 milliliters per minute. Or you can sit there and go, hey, that's a really big number. Let me bring it down to 5.6 liters per minute. So you can bring it down. Either way, I don't care. What you should expect the in-class people for their exam is the back page, you will get a single waveform. Could be just the volume, could be just the pressure, could be just the aorta, usually not that. Usually volume, pressure, or electrocardiogram. And then you'll have to just draw the other ones, but use the timings to sort of put it all together. And then I'll usually ask you questions. Show me on the graph where isoflumate contraction is, or you either put this flat line where the semilunar valve opens or valve closes. So you're spotting stuff. The online people already be drawn, but they're identifying things, and they're also, and everyone's going to be able to identify from the volume where end diastolic volume is. Either I give you the number. Basically, there's 3 volumes you're going to be dealing with: end diastolic volume, end systolic volume, and the stroke volume. You're always going to get 2 of the 3. So it's pretty easy math to figure out what the other one is, right? So you'll have that. You will have to calculate cardiac outputs. You'll have some basic data. Blood pressure. That's what I forgot to put on here. So say this person's blood pressure is, let's pick a 145 over 82. I don't know, just wacky numbers. I may say, hey, on this graph, on the y-axis, indicate the blood pressure points. So where would you put the 82 on this graph?
Where the is. The semilunar valve opens.
And which one? So this one?
Yeah.
Yep, you're right. So here we have number 82. This is where 8 would be. And where would we have the 145? So it would match this here, 145. Or I don't give you blood pressure. Maybe I just have this marked here. And I got this over here, and I'm like, hey, you're going to tell me the blood pressure. And I have, this graph here, like 20, blah, 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 blah. You draw, and then I'm like, what is this guy's blood pressure? And you sit here and you run it over and go, oh, it's about this, about whatever the peak is. So you're either reading it off of the graph, or you get it and you know where to put it on the graph. Okay, so this is our big picture. Now you know what you're in for, okay? Now I'm going to erase it all, and we're going to do an easy way. So if we started with left ventricular pressure, and I want you to do all that other stuff that we did. The easiest way to go about this, the first thing you do is you just mark the valves. If you just look at this and go, I'm going to go here, 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 you just eyeball those 4 spots. So no matter what we're doing with the graph, they're all visually and qualitatively in those same areas on the graph. It doesn't really matter what the pressures are. That's really what's going to be, where they'll be located. Once you've placed the valve points, the volume diagram becomes a complete piece of cake. You know it's going to be full on this side, and you know it's going to be empty on this side, right? So I just take these 2, I go down, I'll draw dot to dot, because we know it's going to be flat between those 2, right? These 2, it's going to be on the empty side. So I will go dot. You're with me on that? So you essentially have this little hump here will be there. You go and say, during this part it's filling, still filling. between the two valves, or between these valves, it's flat. And obviously, we're going to draw the slide right there. See how easy the volume became when you just mark the valves? After this point, we know it fills up again. Oops, I should do that in green. Are you guys okay with that? Does that make it a little bit easier? It's starting to look a little crazy, but if you just took the pressure and marked the valves, things will start to fall into place. And then for the aortic pressure, you do this nice little slide down, hit the first dot, follow the ventricular pressure, hit the second dot, bounce up, and then slide on out. This is P aorta. And then last but not least, the electrocardiogram. We have the P wave that's going to be right before this. So we'll go P wave. QRS is going to match up right here at this corner. T wave is going to be after this. And we just draw lines in between. Once you've drawn this, then would you be able to identify and be able to name? Because even if you don't know the name, you just know where these dots are. But then you should then be able to go, oh, I know which one is, so if we name these, let's see, if I call these here. A, B, C, D. Let me see. D, E, F, G. Okay. All right, so I sort of did these letters here so you guys can shout out parts. So don't worry about the letters for your test. It's just me to ask you a question and then you can tell me more easily. So if I were to say, tell me what part on this graph would represent aortic semilunar valve closure. C, excellent. What part on the graph would be ventricular filling? The filling up of the ventricle. Yeah, E and then F. The F would be specifically the atrial contribution to the filling. But E and F together is filling up of the ventricles. What part would represent atrioventricular valve closure? Excellent. Where would you find atrioventricular valve opening? D. Yes. Which one would represent isoflumate relaxation? I. And yes, C to D. C to D and I are the same thing. And then what would represent diastolic blood pressure? B. Yes. What would represent aortic semilunar valve opening? Also B, yes. So it could be the same thing. It's just obviously, so this would be representing diastolic blood pressure, but on a valve event, it is also the same time that that aortic semilunar valve would open. And then you should be prepared to calculate, you know, based on numbers that you're getting, what the end diastolic volume is, that's the fullest, or end systolic volume, stroke volume, and cardiac output. Those would be some numbers that you would. Cardiac output is the only thing and blood pressure you can't get, well, you could get from the blood pressure from the graph. If I had this here, if we went 0, 20. Okay, what's this person's blood pressure? Pretty much what I said I'm never going to do, but close.
67, or no?
Well, that would be about 70.
110
So,
over 70?
yeah, 110 over, yeah, 70 would be kind of the ballpark. So you're either reading the guy's blood pressure or I give you the blood pressure and you mark it on here. So they've got that, the volume we'll be doing, say, if I say, and I like making up numbers, so if I say 150 milliliters, and I put this here as 50 milliliters, then I'll say, what is this person's stroke volume? So if the end diastolic volume is 150 and the end systolic volume is 50, 100 is the stroke volume. And if the heart rate was 70 beats a minute, what's their cardiac output? 7,000 milliliters per minute, or 7 liters a minute. So you're able to extract this information. So I wanted to just make sure we had all of that covered.